Good morning again. I am Pam Schuman, and I'm your service leader for today. I'm delighted to be this. Let us now enter into sacred time and place. As we gather to celebrate the season of birth and rebirth, we hear the heartbeat of Mother Earth. With spring comes the blossoming of plants and emerging patterns of life. We hear the heartbeat of Mother Earth. In this, the time of growth and reflection, let us draw closer to nature and to each other. We hear the heartbeat of Mother Earth. In the continuing circle of life, giving thanks, we hear the heartbeat of Mother Earth. Come, let us worship together.
The first reading today is by Anne Lamont from her book, Bird by Bird. I love to see people in gardens. I love the meditation of sitting alone in gardens. I love all the metaphors that gardens are. The garden is one of two great metaphors for humanity. The other is the river. Metaphors are a great language tool because they explain the unknown in terms of the known. Well, the garden did not start out as a metaphor. It started out as paradise. Then, as now, the garden is about life and beauty and the impermanence of all living things. The garden is about feeding your children, providing food for the tribe. It's part of an urgent territorial drive that we can probably trace back to animals storing food. It's a competitive display mechanism, like having a prize bull, this greed for the best tomatoes and English tea roses. It's about winning, about providing society with superior things, and about proving that you have taste and good values, and you work hard. And what a wonderful relief, every so often, to know who the enemy is. Because in the garden, the enemy is everything. The aphids, the weather, time. And so you pour yourself into it, care so much, and see up close so much birth and growth and beauty and danger and triumph. And then everything dies anyway, right? But you just keep doing it. What a great metaphor.
Our second reading comes from Second Nature, a book by Michael Pollan. And in this particular chapter, he talks about nothing but weeds. It starts off, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who as a lifelong gardener really should have known better. He once said that a weed is simply a plant whose virtues we haven't yet discovered. Weed is not a category of nature, but a human construct, a defect of our perception. This kind of attitude, which comes out of an old American strain of romantic thinking about wild nature, can get you into trouble. At least it did for me. For I had Emerson's pretty conceit in mind when I planted my first flower garden, and the result was not a pretty thing. Perhaps having read too much Emerson and too many of the sort of gardening books that advocate wild gardens and nails a pair of knowing quotation marks around the word weed, a sure sign of ecological sophistication, I sought to make a flower bed that was as natural as possible. The result was not pretty. And he says, the first summer, my little annual meadow thrived, pretty much conforming to the picture I had in mind when I planted it. However, weeding this dense tangle was soon all but impossible. But after the pigweed scare, he had a pigweed scare, I'd adopted a more or less laissez-faire policy toward the uninvited. The weeds that moved in were ones I was willing to try to live with. And so I tried to do that first year, and I also had to decide in my own mind, were the flowers that I planted, were they more beautiful than the ones the wind had sown? I liked how wild my garden was, how peaceably my cultivars seemed to get along with their wild relatives, and I liked how unneurotic I was being about weeds. So, how does your garden grow? Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. Since I wanted to use a line from this poem as a title for this sermon on gardens, I did a little research to see what it meant. To my dismay, I found the rhyme is not just about a little girl who has an unusual, contrary taste in garden design. No, it has a much more disturbing meaning historically, as some children's tales ironically do. This one dates back to Tudor times in the British Isles when one of two Catholic monarchs named Mary, either Mary, Queen of Scots, or Bloody Queen Mary of England, the elder sister of Elizabeth I, historians aren't quite sure which Mary this is. Anyway, she was trying to reinstate Catholicism after Henry VIII had abolished it and set up his own state religion during his reign. So the garden here meant the kingdom where Catholicism was to be brought back. The silver bells alluded to church cathedral bells, and the garden's growth was accomplished by forcing adherence to the former religion through the use of devices of torture, such as thumb screws, the cockle shells, and iron maidens, the pretty maidens. What? Not a happy little start, is it? But I still like the title despite its grim history and decided to keep it because it fits well with what I have to say today. So rest assured, the sermon is not about that time and place and certainly won't be gloomy. How can it be? This is about the Horizon Community Garden and what gardens mean to us. So I begin again. I'm so excited about our community garden. It's really here. I went out and looked this week and took some photos. And how does our garden grow? Well, it's not just beds of dirt anymore. The little plants of tomatoes and squash and pepper are putting forth their fruits. And there are those pretty little white daisies. Not a lot of anything yet, but it started. It will grow. Why? Because that's nature's way. And because we have a group of dedicated gardeners who took the dream of a garden and made it real. And they keep it real every week, out there in the sun, tilling, planting, watering. This attraction to growing things I understand, even if I can't call myself a gardener. It's primal to me. I remember that even as a child, every spring, I'd get this intense yearning to grow something. I still do. And so my mom would buy me a packet of seeds, didn't matter what they were, and I'd dig a little trench in the strip of grass by our driveway with a stick or something and scatter in the seeds. I'd water them, watch them like a hawk daily, and soon a few little green heads would pop up. Exciting, thrilling. Why? Interestingly, I found my captivation with growing things deciphered in a book not about gardening, but in how to write. In Bird by Bird, teacher and writer Anne Lamott breaks down the writing process for her students and other would-be writers in each chapter. And along the way, she provides some witty and wonderful autobiographical narratives to illustrate her points. It's in the chapter called Set Design that she tackles the concept of how to create a setting for characters to be in. Her real-life example includes her experience in having to set the stage for a character who loves to garden. However, Lamott tells us apologetically, I do not love to garden. Determined to be knowledgeable about her character's interests, even if only vicariously, she humorously tells us about doggedly consulting many experts about the gardening process for the rest of the chapter. But along the way, she tells us something more. Immediately, I connected with some of Lamott's feelings when she asserts, "I love other people's gardens and I like cut flowers." Yes, other people's gardens. Yes, cut flowers, indeed. But do I grow them myself? Apologetically, no. Like Lamott, I confess I don't love to garden, at least not on a grand scale. Just looking at our horizon gardeners in action reminds me why. I don't want to physically work that hard. I don't want to be out in the summer heat. I don't have the dedication to consistently slog through all those messy chores that true gardening requires. So much for my primal yearnings. Thank goodness others do love those chores, however. After all, as Lamott notes, a garden is about feeding your children, providing food for the tribe. It connotes sustenance and survival in a literal way. But I also wholeheartedly agree with her declaration, I love other people's gardens. Why then is a garden still so alluring in concept to even non-gardeners? Appealing to us modern civilized folk who live in urban surroundings, who don't have to farm to eat. Lamott becomes not so down to earth when she answers this. The appeal can be literal, connected as it is to staying nourished and enjoying being outdoors. But it's also figurative, even allegorical, because of its metaphorical place in our imagination. She proclaims, I love all the metaphors that gardens are. All the metaphors? What does she mean? Well, says Lamott, the first garden wasn't a metaphor, but a paradise. Yes, Eden, the original garden home of the first human beings, according to the Judeo-Christian Bible. It was a place of great beauty and abundance of everything that humans, flora, and fauna needed. No stress, just loveliness and calm and perfection. Gardens are still much this way and still provide us with a sense of well-being. Just the thought of one conjures up a good feeling. But if we're actually in one, the feeling pervades our whole being and all our senses. Color and fragrance, soft breezes melting away of tension and distress. Science has even confirmed that beauty and serenity are good for our body and soul. No wonder we love a garden, whether in our mind's eye or in actuality. I wonder if it might also have to do with subconsciously sensing the care that went into creating and maintaining it, even if that care does not come from us. A garden is a product of love, after all, for the elements of the garden, for the earth itself, and for those who will be in the garden. Love makes the garden grow even more valuable to all who experience it. But as the song says, if nothing's wrong, then nothing's right. Too much of a good thing can make it become commonplace and unappreciated and, well, dull. But as we know, life is scarily unpredictable and can be dangerous and often surprises us, not always in a good way. And so Lamott mentions that the garden, being a good metaphor for life, takes the starker side into account as well. In real life, plants and gardens grow and bloom after a lot of hard work and sweat, and if the gardener's lucky, but the enemy is always lurking, and plants are always under threat of insect or fungal infestation, drought or flooding or high wind and starvation. Then they die away anyway, just like humans. How perfect is that? But metaphorically, the garden is reflecting life itself in its impermanence and fleeting glory. Gardens teach us to appreciate the beauty while it's there, with beauty figuratively representing the good and beloved things in our lives. In the garden, beauty, like a flower and like a person, dies off, and new life and new beauty return in their place. The cycle replays endlessly. Knowing things don't last and knowing that more will come are comforting in this otherwise uncertain life. A garden reenacts this, and we intuitively feel the peace of its eternal message of hope. And so, Lamott concludes, you pour yourself into it, care so much, and see up close so much birth and growth and beauty and danger and triumph. And then everything dies anyway, right? But you just keep doing it. Why? Because we humans need to keep creating reminders, like gardens, for when life hits us with pain and brutality, lest we forget that there is hope, also hope and love. Our second reading came from a book that really is about gardening. And it does bring up some philosophical views on what constitutes beauty and what's worth growing in your garden. Michael Pollan in Second Nature, A Gardener's Education, spends one whole funny and informative chapter on nothing but weeds, a label he ultimately dismisses as inaccurate and mean, just like Alice, which was called a weed. In light of what Anne Lamott has revealed to us about gardens in general, this particular message of weeds also becomes a great metaphor for our UU principles of the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the interdependent web of all existence. Like Lamott, Pollan was ignorant about gardening at first, but unlike her, he decides to give it a shot. As any seasoned gardener will tell you, this also means taking up the challenge of weeds. Pollan the novice initially starts with that natural garden, the kind of garden that the 19th century naturalists and romantics would have just loved, where the words weed and wild were simply wonderful. Don't forget those quote marks to designate that weeds do not really exist. A garden where cultivated seeds and those of weeds could exist peaceably side by side in glorious disarray and unrestrained freedom to be. After all, didn't someone with the philosophical wisdom and clout of no less than Ralph Waldo Emerson declare, a weed is simply a plant whose virtues we have not yet discovered? Pollan also declares that at that point, he felt that he had no right to decide that the flowers he planted were more beautiful than the ones the wind had sown. After all, wasn't the word weed not a category of nature, but a human construct, a defect of our perception? Then time marches on. Pollan's natural garden gets so wildly free that it's totally beyond his control. He learns a thing or two about so-called weeds, and his perceptions change. Pollan's second garden, with the uncultivated growth more reasonably hoed, but not neurotically so, reflects this change in outlook. He notes that even the likes of naturalist Henry David Thoreau eventually had to attack with a hoe those plants whose virtues were discovered to be undesirable, that were growing in his bean garden at Walden. And if he was to have any harvest at all, out came the hoe. Pollan comes to the conclusion that the Emersonian definition of a weed as simply a plant like any other but in the wrong place at the wrong time holds true. He discovers through his research of plants that we now call weeds when they show up unwanted in our lawns and gardens. All those beautiful dandelions, wherever I've put them, and the clover and all of those other things that are in our beautifully green carpets of lawn. They actually came to exist in America not because of nature itself, but because of humans. European colonists caused both intentional and unintentional seed spreading in the New World, it seems. For example, the dandelion. Most people do know that you can eat dandelions. You can make soup and tea and all kinds of things out of dandelions. They brought them over. Blame them. But this spreading of the seeds was, again, came to be known as weeds if they were in our lawn. It seems these seeds were especially adapted to thrive best in cultivated soil. In other words, the ones that man had hoed. And this is a condition that is caused by gardening humans. So-called weeds are certainly interdependently connected with us, as it turns out. So Alice finds out that being called a weed is not a pleasant thing. Such name-calling amounts to denying the inherent worth of the person or plant and makes them be bullied in this way. Our song about seeds and our labeling something negative as a weed can now be metaphorically joined to our UU faith. If we want to grow a metaphorically beautiful garden in our society with the desirable results of joy, peace, and love blooming, modeling after our Horizon Garden, we need to sow seeds of words and actions in our hearts that we have deliberately cultivated to produce that result. This we know. But what about all those uncultivated seeds that show up unbidden in our daily living? The surprises and challenges and dangers that life throws at us. Should we dismiss them arbitrarily as wild, unknown things and therefore not good? Or would it be better to first use our intelligence and compassion to discover if they have any kind of virtue before dismissing them? Yes, certainly weed out from our garden the invasively destructive deeds and ideas that we determine lack virtue. They would lack the ability to grow joy, peace, and love. But could our garden metaphors remind us to think outside the box a little, to see if a change of mind, some new seeds, might also grow good things, might help us to be more inclusive and tolerant of the new and the different, not just the beautiful and the expected? Would this be, as Norbert Chapek would say, God's vision growing? May it be so, and amen.